Hey, thanks for coming. This is the story of the Great Forest. And um, and this comes after the story of Ahalya. Um, and the idea, this is an analogy compared to your own life. So it starts off with, O Rama, whatever might have been the origin of the mind and whatever it might be now, one should constantly direct it towards liberation through self-effort. Okay. The pure mind is free from latent tendency and therefore it attains self-knowledge. Just a quick note about this. It's free from latent tendencies. Okay, so your past samskaras don't impel you to action. And therefore, you'll stay where you are and become self-realized. But it takes some time because Vashista says, and therefore it attains self-knowledge. It doesn't say exactly when you do, it just says you will. And this is compared to the statement in the Bible, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. To see God everywhere is to become self-realized. Since the entire universe is within the mind, that's what the other stories have been telling you, the notions of bondage and liberation are also within the mind. Well, that's an interesting concept. So both bondage and liberation are due to the mind, its actions. In this connection, there is the following legend which I heard from the Creator Brahma himself. Listen to it attentively. Okay, there's a great forest, millions of miles in extent. In it, there was just one person who had 1,000 arms and limbs. Well, just a minute. Later on, we're going to hear that there's another one and another one. But let's go back. He was forever restless. He had a mace in his hand, which he beat himself, and afraid of the beating, he ran away in a panic. So obviously this person that's beating himself didn't realize he was beating himself, but was running away from the beating. He ran away in panic. He fell into a blind well and came out of it, again beat himself, and again ran away in panic. This time into a forest. He came out of the forest, beat himself again, and again ran away in panic, this time to a banana grove. Though there was no other being to fear, he wept and cried aloud in fear. He kept running as before, beating himself as before. Brahma says, I witnessed all this intuitively, and with the power of my will, I restrained him for a moment. I asked him, who are you? But he was sorely distressed and called me his enemy and leapt aloud and then laughed aloud. Then he began to abandon his body, limb by limb. Immediately after this, I saw another person running like the first one, beating himself, weeping and wailing. Just a minute. He said that this guy was the only one there. Is this a different one or is it the same one? When I similarly restrained him, he began to abuse me and ran away intent on his own way of life. Like this, I became across several persons. Some listened to my words and abandoning their previous way of life became enlightened. Others even ignored me or even held me in contempt. Some others even refused to come out of the blind well of the dense forest. In just a moment, we'll come back to this. Such is a great forest, O Rama. No one finds a sure resting place in it, whatever may be the mode of life they may adopt. Even today you see such people in this world, and you yourself have seen such a life of ignorance and delusion. Because You are young and ignorant. You do not understand it. Vashista continued. Okay, so Vashista's back in here. O Rama, this great forest is not far away, nor is that strange man in a strange land. The world itself is the forest. The light of inquiry is the eye in the parable. This wisdom is accepted by some and rejected by others who continue to suffer. They who accept it are enlightened. The person with thousands of arms is the mind with countless manifestation. This mind punishes itself by its own latent tendency and restlessly wanders in this world. The blind well in the story is hell, and the banana grove is heaven. The dense forest of thorny bush is the life of a worldly man, with the numerous thorns of wife, children, wealth, etc., hurting him all the time. Now the mind now wanders into hell, now into heaven, and now into the world of human beings. Even when the light of wisdom shines on the life of the deluded mind, it foolishly rejects it, considering that wisdom is its enemy. Then it weeps and wails in distress. Sometimes it experiences an imperfect awakening, and it renounces the pleasures of the world without proper understanding. Such renunciation itself proves to be a great source of sorrow. Well, that's really true. Most people don't think that starting down the spiritual path will lead to sorrow, and it does sometimes. You have to understand. But when such renunciation arises out of the fullness of understanding, of wisdom born of inquiry into the nature of the mind, the renunciation leads to supreme bliss. Okay, so the inquiry has to be done in the right way. So now let's go back. So because we now understand that the person running around with the thousands of arms is the mind, okay, you come back to the idea that this person, Brahma, runs across several people. Some listen to my words and abandoning their previous way of life become enlightened. Well, if you're a realized being and somebody comes along to you, you may know something about them, but you may not know everything. And you may attempt to help them, and they will think that you're trying to hurt them. But the real problem with all this is that somebody will listen to you. Maybe this lifetime, maybe other lifetimes later. So because of that chance, you need to balance what you do with people that come along in this situation. Because of the few, the many are served. But when such a renunciation rises out of the fullness of understanding, of wisdom born into inquiry into the nature of the mind, the renunciation leads to supreme bliss. Such a mind may even look at its own past notions of pleasure with puzzlement. Just as the limbs of the person as they were cut away fell down and disappeared, the latent tendencies of the person who wisely renounces the world also vanish from the mind. Behold the play of ignorance. What makes one hurt oneself out of one's own volition, and which makes one run hither and thither in meaningless panic. Though the light of self-knowledge shines in every heart, yet one wanders in this world driven by one's own latent desires. And the mind itself intensifies this sorrow and goads one to go round in circles. By its own whims and fancies, thoughts and hopes, it binds itself. When it is visited by sorrow, it despairs and becomes restless. So really, when you're unhappy, it's due to some past karma that's come to you. Well, one who gains wisdom preserves it for a long time. Preserving wisdom, okay? That's what we're talking about. And persists in the practice of inquiry. He does not experience sorrow. An uncontrolled mind is the source of sorrow. When it is understood that the mind is the source of sorrow, you know what to do about it. The sorrow vanishes like mist at sunrise. So again, it takes some time, but small compared to other things that you measure by time. The individualized consciousness, okay, so this is the essence of the Vashista's yoga. The mind has risen in the supreme being, O Rama. It is both different and non-different from the infinite consciousness, even as a wave is different and non-different from the ocean. To the enlightened, the mind is the absolute Brahman and nothing else. To the unenlightened, the mind is the cause of repetitive history, samsara. When dualistic concepts are used by us, O Rama, he's talking about enlightened beings, it is only to facilitate instruction. The division is not real. To say that the wave on the ocean is non-different from the ocean is exactly the same statement. The absolute Brahman is omnipotent, and there is nothing which is outside of it. So all things are inside Brahman. Okay. Now there's absolute Brahman. Jiva is at the junction of consciousness and matter. Here and there, now and then, this power of Brahman makes manifest one or the other of its powers. But all this manifestation is a apparent reflection of the power of Brahman, not a real creation. This creation, transformation, existence, and destruction are all brought about by Brahman in Brahman. It is nothing but Brahman. The instruments of action and endure, birth, death, and exist. All this is Brahman. Nothing else is, even in imagination. Delusion, craving, greed, and attachment are non-existent. How can they exist when there is no duality? Okay, so delusion means to see something that's different. But if everything is the same energy, even the delusion that you see is a manifestation of the energy. So how could you say a delusion was there in the first place? Okay, here's an interesting statement. When bondage is non-existence, surely liberation is false too. So both bondage and liberation are only within the mind of the person. When you get outside the mind, there is no bondage, there is no liberation. Rama asked, Holy Sir, you said that when the mind thinks of something, it materialize. Now you say that bondage does not exist. How can these two separate statements be reconciled? Vashista said, O Rama, the mind in a state of ignorance imagines bondage. That bondage exists only in that state of ignorance. Okay, just as dream objects vanish when the dreamer wakes up, all these hallucinations known as bondage and liberation do not exist in the eyes of the enlightened. So that means that the person who's being talked to is somehow asleep to the reality. And in that dream state, you imagine that you're either in bondage or in liberation, when in fact you're only in a dream state. None of these imaginations exist when you wake up. Now, so that's the end of the story. Real quick, isn't it? But let me show you how Vashista has then gone on to the story of the three non-existent princes to show you the extent of this delusion. Vashista continued, to illustrate this, there's an interesting legend. Kindly listen to it. A young boy asked his nanny to tell him a story, and the nanny told him the following story, to which the boy listened with great attention. Once upon a time, well, yeah, stories start for that, in a city which did not exist, so the city was there, but it didn't exist, like a mirage. There were three princes who were brave and happy. Okay, so we have the heroes of the story. Of them, two were unborn, and the third was not conceived. Well, if it wasn't conceived, did it have a birth? Well, maybe it did. Unfortunately, all their relatives died, so there was no one to tell them how this all happened. The princes left their native city, which did not exist, to go elsewhere. Very soon they fell into a swoon, unable to bear the heat of the sun. Their feet were burnt by hot sand. The tips of grass pierced them. They reached the shade of three trees, two of which did not exist, and the third was not even planted. Well, possibly it was sitting in a pot. Who knows? After resting there for some time and eating the fruits of those trees, they proceeded further. Okay, so if you have a tree that didn't exist and one that was not planted, it's unlikely they had fruit. They reached the banks of three rivers, two of which were dry, and the third there was no water. Oh, it wasn't dry though, it just had no water. The princes had a refreshing bath and quenched their thirst in them. Then they reached a huge city which was about to be built. Oh, okay, well, it's still non-existent, but at least now it's closer to existence. Entering, they found three palaces of exceeding beauty. Two of them had not been built at all, and the third had no walls, just a roof, I suppose. They entered the palaces and found three golden plates. Two of them had been broken into two, and the third had been pulverized. They took hold of the one which had been pulverized. They took 99 minus 100 grains of rice, so actually minus one, and cooked it. They invited three holy men to be their guests. Two of them had no body, and the third had no mouth. So it was pretty easy to feed them, wasn't it? After these holy men had eaten the food, the three princes partook of the rest of the food cooked, that minus 1 grain of rice. They were greatly pleased. Yes, they lived in that city for a long, long time in peace and joy. My child, this is the nanny saying to the young boy, this is an extremely beautiful legend. Pray remember this always, and you will grow up into a learned man. Right. Oh, Rama, when the little boy heard this, he was thrilled. What is known as the creation of the world is no more real than the story of the young boy. This world is nothing but pure hallucination. It is nothing more than an idea. In the infinite consciousness, the idea of creation arose, and that is what is. O Rama, this world is nothing more than an idea. All the objects and consciousness in this world are just an idea. Reject the error of ideation and be free of ideas. Remain rooted in truth, attain peace. Only a fool, not a wise man, is deluded by his own ideas. It is a fool who thinks that the imperishable is perishable and gets deluded. Okay, so he could have said that he could have thinks that the perishable is imperishable. That's also mostly true. Egotism is but the idea based on false association of the self with the physical elements. So you think that you're in your house, okay? Those are physical elements, but you're not really in your house because the false idea is that you will be there forever. At some point, either you or the house will be gone. That's just an idea that that's your house. Egotism is but the idea based on a false association of the self with the physical elements. When one alone exists in all this as the infinite consciousness, how has what is called egotism arisen? In fact, this egotism does not exist any more than the mirage exists in the desert. So to get rid of the delusion that you have an ego is very important. Therefore, Rama, abandon your imperfect vision which is not based on fact. Rest in the perfect vision which is of the nature of bliss and which is based on truth. Inquire into the nature of truth. Abandon falsehood. You are ever free. Why do you call yourself bound and then grieve? The self is infinite. Why in hell and by whom is it bound? Only the physical body can be bound. And that's just an illusion. It's a mirage. To think you are this body is the greatest delusion. There is no division in the self, for the absolute Brahman is all this. What then is called bondage and what is liberation? To say that you've been liberated meant that you were bound at some point. Well, if you're not bound, you're not liberated either. It is only in a state of ignorance that you think you experience pain, though you are untouched by pain. These things do not exist in the self. Let the body rise or fall, or let it go on to another universe. I am not confined to the body. Then how am I affected by all this? The relationship between the body and the self is like the relation between cloud and wind, like the relation between lotus and the bee. When the cloud is dispersed, the wind becomes one with space. When the lotus withers, the bee flies away into the sky. The self is not destroyed when the body falls. The mind does not cease to be when it is burnt in the fire of self-knowledge, not to mention the self. Death is but the veiling by time and space of the ever-present self. Only foolish people fear death. Okay. Abandon your latent tendencies even as a bird wishing to fly into the sky breaks out of its shell. Born of ignorance, these tendencies are hard to destroy, and they give birth to endless sorrow. It is this ignorant, self-limiting tendency of the mind that views the infinite as the finite. However, even as the sun dispels mist, inquire into the nature of the self dispels this ignorant, self-limiting tendency. In fact, the very desire to undertake this inquiry is able to bring about a change. Austerities and such other practices are of no use in this attempt. When the mind is purified of its past by the arising of wisdom, it abandons its previous tendency. The mind seeks the self only in order to dissolve itself into self. This indeed is the very nature of the mind. This is the supreme goal, Rama. Strive for this. So that was the story of the non-existent princes and the story of the great forest. Thank you.